It is such an honor and pleasure for me to introduce Jayne and Phillips, who I should note has just been awarded the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for her book Night Watch. Which she will be presenting this afternoon. Jayne Ann Phillips is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Bunting Fellowship, and 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships. She is a winner of an Arts and Letters Award and the Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Jayne was inducted into the Academy in 2018. She is also a National Book Award finalist and twice a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Jayne Ann Phillips is the author of several novels. In addition to Night Watch, note this down, Black Tickets, Machine Dreams, Fast Lanes, Shelter, Motherkind, Lark and Termite, and Quiet Dell. Night Watch, which was also longlisted for the National Book Award in Fiction and a New Yorker Best Book of the Year, is a mesmerizing story about a mother and daughter seeking refuge in the chaotic aftermath of the Civil War. It is a brilliant and meticulously crafted portrait of family endurance against all odds, a stunning chronicle of surviving war and its aftermath. I relate deeply with this quote from the book: "The fighting has ceased, but not the grief." I will be reminded of this line when I see how easy it is to be fooled by the surface appearances of calm and order, while deeply rooted issues still simmer underneath and threaten to boil over. Indeed, rooted in that sullen and persistent grief, the book reminds us that the past is the present unrecognized. We will be hearing soon from one of our most accomplished novelists. I'm so delighted now to introduce our second author, Rachel Beanland. Rachel Beanland is the author of 2 novels, Florence Adler Swims Forever and The House is on Fire, which she will be presenting this afternoon. The House is on Fire was selected as an Indie Next Pick by the American Booksellers Association, a GMA Buzz Pick by Good Morning America, a Most Anticipated Book by The Washington Post, and one of the best books of 2023 by NPR and The New Yorker. Rachel Beanland's debut novel, Florence Adler Swims Forever, Florence Adler Swims Forever was selected as a book club pick by Barnes & Noble, a featured debut by Amazon, an Indie Next Pick by the ABA, and one of the best books of 2020 by USA Today. It was also named a New York Times Editor's Choice and was recognized with the 2020 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. Her essays have appeared in LitHub, Business Insider, Creative Nonfiction, and Broad Street, among other places. She has benefited from a fellowship at the Breadloaf Writers Conference and residencies at the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, Key West Literary Seminar, Ham Beach Center, and Eastern Frontier Educational Foundation. She attended the University of South Carolina and earned her MFA in Creative Writing program from Virginia Commonwealth University. She is currently the 2023-24 Writer in Residence at the University of Richmond. The House is on Fire is among the very best historical fiction has to offer. In a time when the teaching of history is being criticized and contested, this gripping, meticulously researched, and memorable book reminds us how privilege, sexism, and racism have been ingrained in this country since its inception. I assure you, the book is a thrill to read, and you will finish it wanting more, wishing for the next book to come soon. And now I am so thrilled to introduce our moderator, Melissa Skolsiang, and I'll explain why briefly at the end. Melissa Skolsiang is the author of the novels The Hive and Flood. She is the editor of Grace in Darkness, Furious Gravity, and Grace in Love, which are 3 anthologies by women writers. She is a contributing editor to Fiction Writers Review. She received the Shelf Unbound Best Book Award in 2021 and the Next Generation Indie Book Award in 2023. Her work has appeared in the Atlantic, Miss, Washington Post, Poets and Writers, Plowshares, Literary Hub, and Believer magazine. She has been the recipient of the Bread Loaf Bakeless Camargo Foundation Residency Fellowship, the Center for Mark Twain Studies Quarry Farm Fellowship, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts Fellowship, and grants from the Maryland State Arts Council and the Humanities Truck. She's an associate professor in literature at the American University, where she directs the undergraduate program in creative writing. And here is my quick reveal. She was my professor at the brilliant course in literary editing and publishing. And she was also co-chair of my MFA thesis for the American University's Creative Writing Graduate Program, which I graduated from recently, a week ago.
A week ago. And hold on, Fernando. You are burying the lead here. Fernando's memoir won our thesis award. Let me be clear. And I didn't know you were introducing us.
No, I didn't. I
so
wanted
lovely.
to email you last night, but I said, let it be a surprise.
What a gift.
Okay. Well, let us welcome our authors and the moderator.
This is a very small town, it turns out. A very small town. If you are in the rain, please come in. There are seats inside. There are umbrellas. There's tree. Keith, I see you. I don't think that tree is holding it. Jessica brought her umbrella.
If anyone needs to borrow my umbrella, you can borrow it.
Listen, there's an aisle right here that you can stand in, and we would welcome you. Please be dry, because this is going to be amazing. And you don't want to miss it, right? Come on in. Come on in. Feel free. I do know, Keith, I've stood under that tree quite a bit, so I do know it has some shade to it. But feel free to come on in and join us. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you to the Gaithersburg Book Festival. Thank you to all the volunteers. If you are a volunteer at the Gaithersburg Book Festival, I have probably accosted you today to say, I travel the country. We all do, probably, going to book festivals. And this is my favorite one. It's true, and it's because of the volunteers, and it's because of the community. There are other festivals in this country that you show up to with your books and your hope, and it's wonderful. It is, but it feels a little corporate, I have to tell you, and this one feels homegrown. There are readers in Gaithersburg, Maryland. There are readers here. And if you have not read these 2 books, I need you to leave now. Because you need to run to the tent at Politics and Prose and buy up these books. They will not be there in 10 minutes. I'm letting you know that right now. What an honor. What an honor to be here together with you. I have a few questions. I have so many questions. This is my favorite part of the festival because it's like my own grand book club where I get to read your books and talk about them. I'm also going to ask our authors to read from their books in just a few minutes, which I think is always a treat and a treasure. But I was thinking this morning about the way that these books take me to worlds that I don't occupy, right? I live in Rockville. I teach in D.C. I've lived here for 15 years, and yet I have not lived in an asylum in the Civil War. Right? And I have not lived in Richmond, Virginia, pre-Civil War, in a catastrophe like a fire in the way that it disrupts a community. And these books to me are so important because of that. I don't occupy these worlds, but I can for this time period that I'm reading your books. And I'm thinking about the way that is such an important thing we do. We read to understand worlds that are beyond our own. Worlds beyond what my lived experience is, worlds that exist only in a way on the page can do, that I can understand, that I can occupy. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit first about why these books now? Like what makes these historical books actually incredibly contemporary and urgent?
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please. Just a small question to begin with. Yes.
I have 3 books that I realized were kind of war trilogy. My first novel, Machine Dreams, was about Vietnam, which was a civil war, of course, between North and South Vietnam. Lark and Termite was about the civil war between North and South Korea. And that left me, especially in the past few years, when we're seeing so much division in our country, so many people identifying in almost a tribal way with one side or the other, kind of a lack of dialogue, a lot of conspiracy theories, and all these things were going on during the Civil War and after. And I wanted to kind of write about the Civil War that happened in this country in a way that would be unfamiliar, because I'm following characters very closely, a mother, a daughter, a father who's missing since the beginning of the war, and everything they encounter. I also wanted to write about the world of Appalachian, West Virginia, pre-industrialization, when people really lived very much attuned with nature, getting their medicine, their clothing, their food, everything from the landscape around them. So there's a lot of beauty in the book that has to do with just the natural world and contrasting that, what's happening in the war. So my characters are fleeing from one place to another. It's a journey. The cover is really a metaphor for the book, because this line is sort of the journey, the long journey that they take, and that buckboard moves throughout the book. So I think now is a good time to read about the Civil War.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And Rachel, why Richmond? Why fires? Why
You
destruction?
know, the funny thing is, I kind of got into this book for really practical reasons, which is the pandemic. You know, I had been working on something else, and it was something that was going to require a lot of travel to do the research for. And so in March 2020, when we went into our homes, I thought, ooh, I'm in trouble because I haven't done the research yet. And, you know, I sat around for a couple weeks thinking, well, I'll get back to it. We'll get on planes soon, right? We were just going to flatten the curve. And then, you know, by April, I realized, oh, no, I'm not going anywhere for a while. And I live in Richmond. And the houses on fire really came out of like a thought exercise of me just saying, I think I need to write a book set in my backyard right now, because I don't know when I'm going anywhere ever again. I mean, we had no idea, right? And the Richmond Theater Fire was this event that had occurred, you know, in Richmond in 1811. It was a huge fire. 72 people died. The governor of Virginia died. It was early America's kind of first great calamity in terms of single day loss of life. And it captured the headlines across the United States and even in London. It was just widely reported. But then, of course, disappeared into the history books, or not even really not in the history books. It just disappeared. And so I kind of set out naively thinking I'm going to write a book about the Richmond Theater Fire, this little known event that happened in my backyard, and where I can get to all the archives with my mask, and you know, this will be something I can do. And then I kind of, to get to your question about like why now, as I was working on the book, I realized, oh, I'm writing a book set in Richmond, Virginia in 1811. This is a book about slavery. This is a book about women's rights. This is a book about all of these issues that we were seeing completely play out in contemporary times. And in many cases, I could draw a direct line between what I was researching, what had happened 200 years ago, and what was going on outside my home in 2020. So I kind of stumbled into the reason why.
And that brings me to a question about the research process. I like to do a lot of research in person. And it seems, Rachel, that you wouldn't have had that opportunity, that it had to be something that was local. And I'm also curious, Jayne, where do you begin that research process? Is it with a question? Is it in the archives? How do you make it come alive really on the page?
I really am. I started out as a poet, and I'm still a language-oriented writer, a very slow writer. I sort of compose line by line, and my books occur to me in a particular scene in which the voices and the scene that's happening are there and very immediate. And many books, that section ends up being on page 200, but with this book, the book began with this first section. When you hear the only first person voice in the book is Connolly's. And after I wrote that little piece, I'm going to read the beginning of it to you. There I was with this, what I felt very compelling situation, voices that seemed completely there, but I had no idea what the rest of the book would be. So I tend to follow my own words into the book and let the material of the book dictate the form that it finally takes. So in this book, we start out 9 years after the Civil War with this child who's speaking to us, who knows some things but clearly doesn't know everything, and essentially is a bit of an unreliable narrator. And then the book has a middle section that takes place in 1864, 10 years earlier. And we see all these events that Connolly does not know about, and we really experience what these characters experienced at the time that we meet them. That is, why they are the way they are, and then the book goes forward. In terms of research, I have to. It was 8 years of research.
That's a lot.
Yeah, I have 3 or 4 shelves of research for Night Watch, because it was not only the war and a particular battle, and it was the way people lived in the
hills.
in the hills at that time. It was coming up even with voices and speech patterns that sounded authentic. So there was a lot of research, and I found that very enjoyable.
Because reading is better than writing.
Writing is not fun.
No,
Writing
reading.
is work.
Reading. And what I hear you saying is that inhabiting the time period, inhabiting the characters, being able to hear those voices really authentically, that there's just no replacement for the amount of research that's required in order to do that.
Well, I think the voices come from somewhere first, and then I do the research in order to sustain them, you know?
Okay. And what about you, Rachel? Are you hearing voices as well?
I am sometimes. I did a lot of research early on with this book, just trying to familiarize myself with everything from the fire to, urban slavery to 19th century theater. There were so many different kind of pockets that I had to dig into. I think I also had a moment, like Jayne did, where, I reached a certain point. I wrote the scenes with the fire, which were pretty easy to research. I mean, easy. I use that with quotes. But the information was there. The fire had been very well documented. And then, I got these 4 characters. I'm following 4 people the night of the fire and in the days that follow, as the community is kind of grieving and trying to figure out what to do next. And there was that moment once I got them out of the building where I was like, what now? and then the research has to take the research has to take a totally new turn at that point. I mean, I was lucky with the research. There was a woman, Meredith Henny Baker, who had written a nonfiction book about the fire 10 years earlier, and without that, it would have been really difficult to nail some of this, because the fire really did it got lost. I mean, she discovered it because she was studying sermons. She was a historian, and she was reading sermons, and she couldn't figure out why ministers all over the United States were giving sermons about this one fire. And she's like, why could it have been that important? And then she started digging. So, yeah.
So before we get too far into our conversation about building pieces of fiction, works of fiction on the research of women in particular, I'm going to ask each of you to read. Would you like to read to us?
Should I do my entire reading in one go?
I think so.
Okay.
Let's do that. We want to hear your books. Right? We want to hear your books. Right. They don't want to hear me.
On this.
We are sinking. It's the mud. It's true.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. So one thing, I love introductions that mention so much about the book so that I don't have to, and I love questioners who also do the same. But there's one thing that you need to know about this book, and that is that there was a sort of inverted situation happening, because in the bedlam and the brutality of post-Civil War years, my characters find refuge in an asylum. And how can that be? That can be because of something called moral treatment that, again, isn't generally known about. But there was the first psychiatrist at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital outside Philadelphia imported moral treatment from Europe, and it simply was the idea of treating the mentally ill humanely. And his name was Thomas Story Kirkbride. He's a real person. Part of my research was reading all about him and all about moral treatment. This asylum in near Weston, West Virginia, was 900 square feet inside and went on for a quarter of a mile. Even though it was that large, only 250 people were allowed, in his understanding, to be in the building. They all would have their own rooms, their own windows, and they each had their own, what he called, regimen, which was really a series of activities and 4 and 5 mile walks. But we're going to go back now to Connolly, to just the very first few pages. Connolly, A Journey, April 1874. I got up in the wagon and Papa set me beside Mama, all of us on the buckboard seat. Hold her hand there, he said to me, like she likes. Sit tight in. Keep her still. I saw him lean down and rope her ankle to his. Talk to her, he said. Tell her she'll like it where she's going. A fine, great place. Like a castle with a tower clock. Tell her. You'll like it, Mama, I said. Tell her about them palms. Palm trees in pots, Mama, and velvet sofas like in a city hotel. And don't call her Mama, he said. Don't you see how she's dressed? He'd got the dress from a widow man who was giving away his dead wife's carpet bag and clothes. The petticoats, silk underthings, the satin bodice and jacket with bell sleeves. You know what to call her, he said. Don't fail in it. You said call her Miss Janet, though it's not her name. It is her name now. Her old name won't do her good. Call her by her name. I will, just in a minute, catching my breath. But I put my hand on hers. She was clasping her knees so hard I could feel her shake. I was out of breath from carrying the babbies to the neighbor women. One of them would take the boy because he was walking and talking, and the boy twin if she got both boys. The other woman would take the girl twin, so that was a separate trip. Papa, who's going to feed the chickens while we're gone and find the eggs? That neighbor woman, he said, that took the girl twin. Mama never named the babbies. We only called them so, the babbies, and she nursed all 3. The twins weren't but 12 weeks. Talk to her, Papa said, like I told you. So I'm skipping ahead a bit. They have a journey that involves staying overnight in the woods. And I'm going to skip ahead to when they actually arrive at the asylum. It was first light, and the stone walls looked more blue than gray. There was the clock tower, and above it a spire like a church. No cross, only a point. Didn't I tell you, Papa said, 200 feet tall. It's a wonder, I said. Should I walk inside with her? She's not going in without you, he said. Then he put the reins aside and fixed me in his gaze. Connolly, how old are you? He should have known, but I told him. I'll be 13 at the end of December, born after you went away. Born in 61, the year both sides mustered troops. Tall for your age, but right puny. Too skinny for a man to take on. I considered it, but you'll stay with her. Here? This is home. There's nothing back there. It's all giveaway. It's giveaway? Are you listening to me? Yes, sir, I said, for he liked to be addressed as such. He leaned down and pointed his finger at me until he touched my throat, just at the little notch of bone. Then listen, he said. I'm not your papa, nor have I ever been. I never laid eyes on you or your mama till I came upon you, and you don't know my name. It was true. She had never called him a name. Only at first he bade us call him Papa, and she never said different. So don't be looking for me, he said, or tell anyone where you come from. I only rode you here as a kindness. You was walking along the road, and because she's a quality woman in need of refuge, I rode you here. It was on my way. Tell me. You rode us here, I said. It was on your way. Miss Janet's a quality woman, he said, with no dependents in her family. You're not her family, but a servant. Nowhere to go but with her. Sir, I said. Times is hard, he said, and flicked the reins. You'll tell the story. The wagon was moving off, and his words drifted back with the dust. I wished so hard we'd arrived at night when no one could see us for me to think on our situation. But the sky had lightened, and there was no time. I hoisted Mama's carpet bag and took her arm. We walked slowly along the gravel path. There was no use asking her about Papa if it was true. We'd no relatives I knew of. We lived in Virginia, but now we were not Virginia. I knew from Papa that the name of our state had changed more than once, that West Virginia had betrayed the South and stood for the Union. If Papa was for the South, I was for the Union, and Mama was surely with me. I stood Mama beside me and knocked on the huge black door. I heard the sound of locks opening and bolts sliding, and the door half opened. A tall man, broad in the shoulders, stood looking down at us. He was dressed almost like a train conductor, all in black, and his cap was round with a round bill. He wore a patch that covered his left eye from brow to cheekbone with a livid scar beneath. It was not so fearful or unusual then to see the bandaged or the maimed. I made my voice steady. Good day, I said. I brought Miss Janet for her rest and cure. The staff does not receive at this hour, he said. I felt myself thrown forward then, for my mother had fallen against me with all her weight. I was half in the entrance, my ribs hard against the marble doorstep, and felt him lift her from me as the door swung wide. He pulled me to my feet with one hand as he shut the door behind us and threw the bolt into place. Then he was carrying her across the round, empty room as though she was a child. I ran after them with her carpet bag. She's faint, I was saying. He'd stopped, though, and put her on a chaise and taken a vial from his pocket. Ammoniac, he said, to revive her. He took the small cork from the vial and held it to her nose. She started and drew in her breath, gasping, and opened her eyes on his face that was close to hers. Her gaze widened as though she knew him. Of course she didn't, but I was grateful she didn't seem afraid or call out. I saw now that his eye patch wasn't made of cloth, but of something harder, rounded tin or metal covered with felt, held in place with straps. A scar like an angry bloom was on his temple and disappeared under his cap and shaggy black hair. But she seemed to sense a sudden protection or counsel. Then he stepped back, and she looked wildly around. I reached down to grasp her shoulder. Miss Janet, I remembered to say, you were faint. We've come to the asylum for your rest and cure. I'll call the matron, said our benefactor, but I've got some victuals set out. I'm O'Shea, the night watch. Can you walk, miss? He looked at me when she didn't answer. Girl, he said, if you'll bring her. And he turned on his heel. Our shoes, Mama's and mine, clicked on the marble floor. His footsteps were silent, and such a big man. Then I saw that he'd thick woolen covers tied over his boots. Thanks.
It's treacherous up here. We're sinking, but we will persevere.
We're being careful. All right. I don't know if I need to. We'll be okay. Can everyone hear me? Should I turn it?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, you think I don't need to adjust?
No, you're good to make
Okay, I don't know. All right, hold on.
You need a hand?
Just pull it up. Really? Oh, just like that. You just want me to do this. We're not the same height, turns out. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that was a lovely reading. I really hate following a Pulitzer Prize winner. It's a little stressful. I want you to know, when I was put on this panel, she was not a Pulitzer Prize winner. But I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be with Jayne. So I'm going to read from a section near the beginning of The House is on Fire. As I mentioned, it follows 4 characters. And they were all kind of we start the night of the fire at the theater, as a play is underway. And I purposely wrote people who were in different positions in the building, experiencing the fire from different vantage points. And the fire starts backstage. It actually started up in the fly space above the actors' heads. And there was a young stagehand who was kind of intricately involved in what had happened. At this point where I'm going to start reading, there's already kind of been a kerfuffle about this chandelier that was raised up into the fly space, and someone inadvertently had left a candle burning, because of course every light backstage was a candle, which is not good, right? And so the theater manager has asked Jack to lower the chandelier and put out the candle. But Jack, this 14-year-old stagehand, knows that that's a problem because there's a broken pulley up there. So the manager says, he cuts her off and pokes Jack in the chest. I said, raise the chandelier. Jack nods once and darts off in the direction of the rigging, where he frees the chandelier's rope from its anchor and watches as the prop glides straight up into the air. When the chandelier arrives in the fly space, Jack anchors the rope back into place, then hurries to find Clive so he can explain the situation. By the time Jack locates Clive, Robertson has been captured and brought to the castle, where he's introduced to Margaretta, played by Placide's wife Caroline, and provided accommodations that he will soon regret accepting. There's this whole play happening that you know more about. Jack tells Clive about the chandelier, but he doesn't seem concerned. We'll get to it, he says, soon as this act is over. Jack watches from the wings as Mrs. Green prepares to make her entrance as the bleeding nun and close out the first act. She squares her shoulders and takes 2 deep breaths, and when she moves onto the boards, he could almost swear she is floating. God, what Jack wouldn't give to have a thimbleful of her confidence. He's begun to dream of auditioning for a role in one of the company's many performances. If it were the right part and he were smart about it, he could still keep up with his duties backstage. But what always stops him from even asking about it is the fear that he won't be any good, that when he gets out on stage in front of all these people, they'll be able to see right through him. Mrs. Green arrives at center stage and faces the audience. Everyone in the theater lets out a collective gasp, and by the time the curtain closes a few minutes later, she has stolen the show. The sound of the audience's applause is deafening. Jack is still shaking his head in a kind of bemused wonderment when he looks across the stage and sees Roy in the wings tugging at the same rope Jack only recently tied off. Oi, says Jack as he takes off running across the stage. What are you doing? Twaits told me to get it down, he says. The candles are still lit. Stop. Roy doesn't stop, and Jack watches the chandelier begin to list. Didn't Perry tell you? Jack shouts, but he doesn't have time to explain. The harder Roy tugs on the rope, the wider the chandelier swings. Jack is terrified the flames will come too close to the backdrops and set them alight. I'll climb up there. I bet I can reach it. Just stop what you're doing. He makes for the ladder and is up in the carpenter's gallery when he sees that, in fact, Roy has not stopped pulling at the rope. Instead, he's been joined by Perry, who is putting his whole body into making the rope move. Jack climbs out onto the nearest rafter, shimmying over the heads of the 2 carpenters. Splinters of wood slice into the meat of his hands. When he is as close to the chandelier as he can get, he takes a deep breath and tries to blow the candles out, but the chandelier is too far away for the flames to even flicker. So he licks the pads of his thumb and forefinger and stretches his hand into the air as far as it will go. The chandelier is just out of his reach, but the way the thing is spinning, it's like a pendulum. Jack just has to be patient, and eventually it will arrive in his hand. He wants to try to get Roy's and Perry's attention, wants to tell them that he has the situation under control, but the second act is underway. Perry begins to jostle the rope, a different kind of movement that Jack immediately realizes is no good. "Stop," he yells down to him, not caring who hears him, but it is too late. The chandelier has tipped sideways, and Jack watches in horror as it kisses the edge of the nearest backdrop. What happens next is all sound and light. Jack inches backward along the rafter and away from the flame as fast as he can. By the time he has made it back to the carpenter's gallery, Perry is up there waving at the backdrop and shouting instructions at Jack. "Help me cut this down." Perry has a knife, but Jack has none, and he watches as the carpenter saws at one rope and then another. The fire licks its way onto the top of the backdrop and threatens to touch the ceiling, which is nothing but timber and sap. "Do something, kid," says Perry, a tangle of ropes in his hands, but Jack can't move, can't think of a single thing to do. He barely knows how to make himself useful when everything is going right. Below him on stage, Robertson looks up into the fly space, his eyes widening into orbs. The man's bottom lip trembles as if he is trying to make words but can't force them past his lips. Finally, he pulls his eyes away from Jack and Perry and the flames that rage behind them, turns to the audience and flaps his arms. "The house," he yells, finding his voice at last. "The house is on fire."
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Jayne. I'm curious where these books started. This is a question of craft, right? Like, is it voice? Is it image? Is it a historical fact? How do you do what you do, and where does it start, and how does it end up this way? Just a small process question about the writing.
How did you go first?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. As I mentioned, the fire itself was pretty well documented. So the first kind of 75 pages of the book, once I had nailed my 4 characters, and that took a while, right? Just figuring out which 4, because the fire was so well documented, there were hundreds of stories to come out of the fire. But I knew I wanted, people from different walks of life, people who had experienced the fire differently. And so, I spent some time kind of narrowing that down. Then the fire scene, those scenes were easier because I could picture it, right? And I was very much thinking about, movement and people and where they were and what they were doing and how I was going to get them out, not just out of the building, but into the rest of their lives, right? So I was kind of almost like setting up dominoes that then I would spend the rest of the book knocking down.
Right. I say that about fiction. Just figure out what your characters want.
Right.
And then just take it away from them.
Right.
That's it. And then
Right,
spend
right,
400
right.
pages trying to get it back.
Yeah. So, and for me, I had each of the 4 characters is based on someone real that we know something about, that we know much more about some of those people than others. So there were all of these kind of nagging questions I was interested in. There was an enslaved blacksmith who had run to the fire and saved a dozen white women from the blaze. And his story is very well documented. His name's Gilbert Hunt. But then my question was, well, what happened to him afterwards, right? Because there were so many people who owed him everything. There were stories of enslaved people who perhaps historians believe used the fire as an alibi to escape slavery. So, all the questions kind of like unfurled once they were out of the building for me.
I think the book started for me with Connolly's voice and this kind of outside. I think a child narrator is always kind of an outlaw because they see things without context. They see things in a very direct way. And likewise, I was interested in what would happen to this particular mother and daughter in this situation, and how would they navigate not only the asylum, which was its own world within a world of healing, but also a world in which certain orphan children are growing up in the kitchen. And, well, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but
So
we follow Connolly and her mother Eliza through their relationship. Connolly starts out as the caretaker, and then that changes There's a period of time when they're almost a bit estranged. And then the book goes on until Connolly is about 21. So, yeah, I think your shorthand to find out what they want and then take it away from them. I'm not sure my characters know exactly what they want in the beginning, except to simply be safe. But their struggle, I mean, the reason it's called Night Watch is partly because one of the characters that's his job at the asylum. But it also has to do with communities and individuals. I was interested in sort of unsung, never recorded lives of people who, no matter what threat they faced, would continue to try to protect those they loved. And would do this, beyond anything they could be expected to do. And that we all, in a sense, that they're individuals who are kind of the sort of person who watches through the night. You sort of mothers watch through the night. The cowboys around the campfire take turns sitting watch. Rembrandt's incredible painting, 1642, called The Night Watchman, is all of these men in this sort of cavern wearing these amazing hats and cloaks, and they're each the night watch of their cities. So I was trying to sort of connect to that idea across generations, across centuries, and bring it back to, think about it now.
I have one question about writing historical fiction, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So get your questions ready. I have about 100 more questions to get through, but I'm gonna limit it to this one about writing historical fiction, about where the history is well known, but yet we decide to tell a story that completes it, right? And what liberties we take to be true to the historical fiction fact, but then also to fill in the gaps so that we tell a story that makes it relevant and real for a reader, a modern reader in particular. And I'm wondering how you balance that. I think fiction actually has to be more true than anything else. And I mean true with a capital T, not true, and so maybe talk a little bit about the process of making decisions, what has to be true versus where you take liberties with storytelling.
Yeah. I mean, I've got lots to say. I try to stick to the facts where I've got a documented fact. If we know that a war started in 1861 or something, like I don't change that, right? Some writers do. But, so much of history was written down by white men that there's plenty of gray area and undocumented stories waiting to be told from the perspective of women, white women, people of color, so many different stories that you I read the history and then I find out what's missing, and there's so much missing. And I'll give the story of Sally Henry Campbell, for instance, is a character in this book. She's Patrick Henry's daughter. We know a lot about Patrick Henry. We know that his daughter was in the fire. There's a family legend that she was saved from the fire by a guy she later ended up marrying. Well, I thought, that's a legend. Like, legends get changed all the time, right? It's like a game of telephone. One generation tells another generation tells another generation. That's where I think as a novelist it's fun, is to kind of play with some of those stories and say, well, what if it didn't happen that way? Or what if this story over time has shifted for one reason or another. And in some cases, the stories never even got told at all, right? Or they got told and weren't saved, right? The stories of enslaved people were so often not written down or not preserved by the people who preserve stories, right? So that, for me, is the joy of being a novelist versus a historian, is we get to write into those empty places.
I'm not sure I consider myself to be a historical novelist, even though my books, one of them is set in 1930s, the Depression, another, as I said, the Korean War, the Vietnam War era. They're always different, but I think you're writing history if you're writing about yesterday. I think history tells us the facts, but literature tells us the story inside the facts. And because we're such narrative creatures, we often find the real story inside fiction. And I'm always true to something that is an established fact. For instance, Thomas Story Kirkbride, the physician who invented moral treatment, is referred to in this book, but I invent a character who is his nephew. That character didn't live, but part of his biography it's composed of things that happened to the real character, whereas all of my other characters are fictional. In Quiet Dell, which is a story of a serial murder that happened in 1931, it was one of the first sensationalized murders by the Yellow Press, in which a widow and her 3 children were killed by someone who was writing love letters in the sort of a precursor to Match.com. All of these characters were real, and there were photographs of them in the book, but I made up their thoughts, their points of view, their personalities, the way the family related to one another, the history of the family. And strangely, sometimes I find that I was right about a particular detail later.
Yeah, writers pay attention. We have time for one quick audience question, if there's a burning one out there. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question about your book covers. They're both so unique. How much input?
I can repeat it too, if that's
Okay.
helpful.
Your book covers are so unique. How much input do you have into the final product of your book cover?
Okay. Well, I would say, I mean, I think most writers will tell you don't have a lot of control. That they're making marketing decisions and business decisions that don't have a lot to do with your artistic vision sometimes. I was very pleased with this book cover. And one thing that I had asked for that I was pretty specific on was that I wanted men depicted on the cover as well as women. The story follows 4 people, 2 of whom are men. I think a man could enjoy this book. But 85% of books are bought by women, so books tend to get marketed to women. And so I did want those 15% of men buying books to also consider this. So they did do a nice job of kind of depicting a number of different people on the cover. So I was pleased with that aspect. But.
Well, and there are book covers that have years. Like there's a book cover where everything's flowers. Everything that comes out that year is flowers. And then the year before that is everything. There's a picture of water. And then the year before that. And I'm calling this the ropey year. Like there's ropes on all of the covers in such lovely ways.
I've had knockdown, drag-out fights in the past, especially with paperback covers, because often they think they're all starting over and they're a totally different group. And often things have been done despite my objections. This cover, when I saw it, I was just amazed.
I love it.
I loved it. They made a couple of animated versions of this, one in which the whole book cover comes to life and the buckboard actually moves along the path. And we all love this so much that they're going to make it the paperback cover. And now that the Pulitzer has happened, we've a few more countries.
Just happened.
I was standing there and it happened. I don't know. It hit me. We're trying to encourage even other translations to use this cover.
Fantastic. Are we out of time, Nancy? I do what you tell me to. Yes, ma'am. Any one last minute burning question? Yes, please.
I had a similar question about your first book, Florence Adler Swims Forever. It seems like there was a trend where the full name of the protagonist was in lots of books. And I was wondering if that had an influence on the title or how you came about that title.
I had titled the book years earlier. Like it was a Word document saved on my computer with that title. And it was one of the few times, I think a lot of times people, you sell a book and then someone wants to change the title. But in that case, it stayed the title all the way through. So I'd like to think I was a trendsetter with that idea.
Novel 1, novel 2 on
yes,
my desktop.
I agree with you. There are a lot of books with first name, last name doing something. So yeah.
Thank you so much. What an honor. What a
Oh,
pleasure.
it was my
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.